Welcome to Instrumental History. My name is Clint Holley, and I will be your host this evening as we explore and tell stories about one of the most iconic instruments in popular music, Jimmie Rodgers' 1928 0045 Martin guitar. Often called the Blue Yodel guitar, this instrument is currently on display at the birthplace of Country Music Museum in Bristol, Virginia. To find out more information about the museum, you can visit www.birthplaceofcountrymusicmuseum.org, and you can plan your trip to see this iconic and beautiful instrument. This is episode 2, and in episode 1, we explored the history of Jimmie Rodgers, how Jimmie Rodgers met Ralph Peer, why he came to Bristol in 1927 to record his first sides, and the fallout of what happened after he became a superstar. And one of those things was he had this guitar made by the Martin Guitar Company, and at its time was one of the most fancy guitars ever produced. The guitar has passed through several hands over the years. It was in Ernest Tubb's possession for almost 40 years and then returned to the Jimmie Rodgers family. The Jimmie Rodgers family has loaned the guitar to the birthplace of Country Music Museum, and it is on display here for a limited time. We have 2 wonderful guests today on the show. The first is Jason Honor. He's the chief archivist and historian at the Martin Guitar Company in Nazareth, Pennsylvania. And the second is world-respected luthier and guitar builder Wayne Henderson. His guitars are based on pre-war Martin guitar designs, and his guitars are owned by people like Tommy Emmanuel, Vince Gill, and Eric Clapton. So he has reached the pinnacle of guitar building, and he's got a lot to say about Martin guitars and their value and what makes them iconic instruments. So let's let these great guests do the talking tonight. We're going to start with a brief overview of the Martin Guitar Company. So if you're into guitars, Jimmie Rodgers, Martin guitars, kick back for the next hour and enjoy this beautiful tribute to Jimmie Rodgers and the Martin Guitar Company tonight on Instrumental History.
My name's Jason Honor, and I manage the archives in the museum at Martin Guitar. So I've been with the company about 11 years. I actually started in the factory in the polishing department. And then I worked for about 5.5 years in customer service where, one of the things, I've been fascinated with guitar since I was a little kid, and I've always loved history. Right. So it's like, here's the perfect blend of both. And I had been studying the history of the company for about 15 years before I actually started here.
Right.
But, I thought I knew quite a bit when I started, but working in customer service, you really get to know like all the odds and ends, and you get asked all sorts of questions. And if you want a great education on Martin guitar, apply for a job here in customer service because you'll learn a lot.
I can imagine. How many guitars does Martin have in its lineup these days? I know there's the traditional guitars that everybody knows, but they've really kind of in the last decade or so really kind of expanded their offerings. So kind of tell us a little bit about what goes on at Martin these days.
We have well over, I think it's close to around 100 different models.
Wow.
You factor in all the different finish packages and everything. So, at the Nazareth factory here, you're looking at 15 series and above. So all your 15, 16, 17 series up to your standard series, which is kind of that the trademark Martin lineup where you have styles 18 through 45. Then obviously we have limited editions we do every year, whether they're artist signature models. Like right now we're building a Rich Robinson signature model. And then we have our custom shop, which pretty much anything you can dream of, they can build.
Right.
They also build our authentic line of guitars, which we normally take an instrument from our museum collection and try to replicate it as closely as possible, going down to the way they did the finish, the way the braces were shaped. What we do is we take those instruments and run them through an X-ray machine.
Okay.
And then we can take a look at exactly how they were braced and, everything on the inside, and then replicate it. So in vintage guitars, especially in vintage Martin guitars, especially that pre-war period, what we call the golden era, when they sell, you're talking about, could be hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Right.
And it's not because they were owned by somebody famous. It's just because really they're modern acoustic guitars. And because of the way they age, they sound so good.
Right.
So one of the things that we try to do when we build our authentics is, it's difficult replicating the sound of a guitar that's 80 years old in a new instrument.
Right.
So now on our authentics, we use our vintage tone system, which is the top is torrefied, which gives the guitar more of a vintage sound than just a new piece of wood.
Okay. Now I've read like guys that like buy a new guitar and they stick it in front of a speaker for like, days on end to like get that vibration into the wood.
Exactly.
Do you guys feel that it's the sound waves, or is it something chemical or structural in the wood that ages over time?
It's a few things.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the more you play a guitar, the better it's going to sound, because you're loosening because we take a tree that's standing in a forest, we cut it down, cut it into these thin pieces, put strings on it, and it's stiff.
Right.
Even though the wood's thin, it's still kind of stiff. So the more you play a guitar, it loosens the fibers of the wood.
Okay.
And as the guitar ages, the wood starts to lighten a bit, and it can vibrate more freely. So there's definitely people that do that. Will stick the guitar in front of their speaker, or there's that tone right machine that you put on the bridge that sends vibrations through the top. So there's a few different things you can do to help, advance that process if you can't play your guitar 8 hours a day.
Give our listeners who might not know, like aren't obsessive about guitars like we are, give them since we're going to talk about the Jimmie Rodgers Blue Yodel guitar, give them a brief history of the Martin Guitar Company from its founding, 1833 to 1928, when they made the guitar for Jimmie Rodgers.
Well, the company was founded by Christian Frederick Martin Sr. A little background on him: he was born in a town in Germany called Markneukirchen, and they were really known for violin building there. And Christian's father was a cabinet builder, but most of the time he wasn't building furniture; he was building violin cases.
Okay.
But he was also one of the earliest guitar builders in Germany at that time. So if you look back, the earliest six-string guitar was built in 1779, so less than 20 years before Christian was born.
Okay.
But it was catching on throughout Europe, and as Christian got older, his father saw that he had more interest in building guitars than he did in building furniture. So he ended up getting Christian an apprenticeship with Johann Stauffer in Vienna, Austria. He was in Vienna for a little over a decade. He met his future wife, Holley, there. They got married, had their first child, C.F. Martin Jr., and then they moved back to Markneukirchen. And I guess their dream was, we're going to set up a family home and a shop here in Germany and live happily ever after. But the issue was there was a guild system. And the Violin Makers Guild saw the potential of the guitar, and they thought they had the sole right to build any stringed instrument.
Okay.
So there were these court battles that ensued. And every time the court sided with Martin and the cabinet makers, because the guitars Martin was building were the best they had ever seen.
Yeah. Right.
So this goes on for a few years, and then he decides, I need a new opportunity. He's tired of the restrictive guild system. So his family and him leave Germany, arrive in New York City in November of 1833. They spent about 6 years in New York City, and then they had thought about moving back to Germany because they didn't really like the atmosphere there. But luckily they had a family friend in the Nazareth area that Adelie Martin visited, and she wrote a letter to her husband and said, this place is great. There's a large German-speaking population. It's rolling countryside. We need to move here. So in 1839, the Martin family moved to the Nazareth area. And then eventually, when the Moravians that own Nazareth opened up the community, they purchased land and built their homes and the North Street factory here in Nazareth.
Does that factory still exist?
It does. We house our guitar makers connection there, where you can buy parts and kits from. Mm-hmm. So that factory was in operation from 1859 until 1964, when this North Street factory that we're in now was open. So as the 1800s are moving along, C.F. Martin, pretty much builds what becomes the American guitar. He invents X bracing in 1843, refines the shape and dimensions of guitars. After he dies, the company passes to his son. So that was 1873. And then his son really doesn't do much to change the company. He kind of standardizes the lineup a little bit more. He does bring in steam-powered equipment in 1887 to help modernize the company. Because if you look back then, there were companies out of Chicago, mostly Lion and Healy, that were building 100,000 guitars a year.
Right.
And that's what we build now.
Right.
But back in the 1880s, Martin was building a few hundred.
I think that's what a lot of people don't know, that Chicago used to be the kind of the guitar building capital of the world at one time.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, all of it was Lion and Healy. They were building Washburn, and then you had like the Sears and Roebuck guitars and
Harmony and Kay.
Harmony, Stella, Kay. Yeah, all of those brands were coming out of Chicago.
Right.
And they were just, they were mass producing them. So if you look back then and compare it to now, it's pretty equal to our production now. And I mean, it's pretty fascinating that they were able to build at that scale. Now, one of the things...
That's why the necks all fall off of them, too.
Exactly. The huge difference is the 100,000 guitars we build now are high quality.
Correct,
right. What they were building back then, like you said, the necks fall off or bridges fall off, all of those issues. And they really weren't using premium materials like Martin used.
Right.
I mean, even by the 1880s, Martin had built that reputation as, the finest guitar builder in America. And it was something that they would never stray from.
Right.
But they did want to advance the company. So they brought in steam-powered equipment. Then C.F. Martin Sr. dies in 1888. And then his son, C.F. Martin Jr. dies in 1888. And his son, Frank Henry Martin, who's only 22 at the time, takes over. He's a little more outgoing. He wants to grow the company beyond the guitar. So he introduces the mandolin first in the 1890s, and then eventually the ukulele in the 19-teens.
Okay.
And the ukulele is one of the reasons why Martin was able to survive the Great Depression.
Okay.
I mean, sales were so good throughout the 20s. They were building some years 3 times as many ukuleles as guitars.
Wow. Okay.
And then also under Frank's watch, the company invents the Dreadnought in 1916. And then the orchestra model, the OM-28 in 1929. Okay. Which is considered the first modern flat top guitar.
Wow. I just got to visit Wayne Henderson in Rugby, Virginia, and he's got one of the original OMs that still has the banjo style tuners on it. And that is an amazing instrument.
Yeah, they had pyramid bridges, the banjo style tuners. A few years later in 29, Martin would introduce our belly style bridge, which helped support the top a little more. And then eventually a couple years later, start using Grovered geared tuners, similar to what we would use now.
Right. Now, what musical trends were happening in the early 20th century that drove this guitar design kind of renaissance? And tell us how guitars were marketed. One of the common conventional wisdoms is that the small guitars were marketed to women to play in the parlors of their homes and stuff like that. So tell us a little bit about the marketing strategy of early guitars, say from the late 1800s into the 1920s.
Well, that's where you hear that term parlor guitar a lot. It's used kind of loosely now. Some people even refer to like a Martin 00 as a parlor. But traditionally, if you look at a Martin size 1, which we don't even build anymore, that and smaller would be your parlor guitar. And that's exactly where that term comes from, is they were played by women in the parlors of their homes to entertain guests.
Right.
So early on, the majority of guitars were built for women. As the guitar gains popularity, the sizes get bigger. Martin builds the first single O in 1854, the first double O in 1858, and then they don't build the first triple O until the early 1900s.
Okay.
Because what you're starting to see then is steel strings trickling in.
Right. And
that's a direct result of Hawaiian music.
Okay.
So in the 1880s, there's 2 musicians from Hawaii who are friends, Mikia Kealakai and Joseph Kukuku. So they take piano wire and string a guitar with it, invent this brand new playing style.
Right.
And as Hawaiian music starts to spread in the mainland, the popularity of the steel string guitar also starts to grow.
Right.
Then there's the San Francisco Pan American Exposition in 1915, which featured Hawaiian music. And then from there, you really see, especially with Martin, one, ukulele production, and then two, Martin started building steel string guitars on a regular basis.
What year do you feel that Martin really committed themselves to building the steel string instruments? I've heard a different range of years, so I'd like to hear it directly from you.
It's really 1927.
1927? Okay.
Yeah, by that point, steel strings would become standard. Gut strings were still available on a special order basis, but I mean, that change happened pretty quickly.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
they're building their first steel string guitars 1915 and 1916 for, they started out building for one of their customers, Southern California Music. They were building private label instruments for them. And then eventually their largest customer, the Ditson Company from New York, starts requesting steel strings. And then from there, you just see it take off. And then Martin introduces their first model that's only offered with steel strings in 1922.
Okay.
So it's a very quick transition for a company that at that point was almost 100 years old.
My second guest today on Instrumental History is world-renowned luthier Wayne Henderson. Wayne has been building guitars for over 50 years, and he bases his guitar designs on the vintage classic Martin designs of pre-World War II. If you hear people say pre-war Martin, that's exactly what that is. Although the boundaries of that stretch into World War II, but generally it's regarded that the instruments made before 1944 by the Martin Company are what's called the Golden Era. And Wayne designs his guitars on those Golden Era Martins, and his guitars reside in the collections of people like Gillian Welch, Vince Gill, Ricky Skaggs, Tommy Emmanuel, and many others. Wayne is a humble man, and he loves to talk guitars. So let's meet Wayne and find out a little bit more about his personal background, his history, and what made him start building guitars in the first place.
I'm Wayne Henderson. We're here in Rugby, Virginia, and I'm a luthier, and that's a sort of fancy word. I always thought it's for a guitar builder, and that's what I've been doing for 50-some years probably, and it's what I like doing, and I've been, even when I had other jobs, carrying the mail and stuff like that, I still worked in my shop and built guitars almost every day of my life.
Wow.
And I've always been into that.
Were you born in this area?
Yeah, I was raised right here in this same community.
And this is
where we are now.
This is Grayson County?
It's Grayson County, and this community right here is called Rugby.
Okay.
I don't reckon it's got anything to do I know of with British football, but or the rugby game or whatever that is.
Right.
And I've always lived right here, and it's it's real close by North Carolina, and not far from Tennessee either.
Right.
Down the corner of Virginia, and it's always been a hotbed for old time music, and might be one reason I was into that, just because of the community.
Right.
Here, you can go any direction, not very far, you can find all kinds of musicians.
Right.
And the most of them grew up doing that, the ones that are still around and stuff.
What are your earliest memories of music?
I guess my dad was an old-time fiddle player.
Okay.
And I can remember him playing on that fiddle as far back as I can remember anything.
Okay.
When I was just a small kid. And he, like most of the old-time musicians around here, when they started raising a family, they sort of quit playing music, or the music was just a hobby. Mm-hmm. Then they'd do it for fun. Mm-hmm. But they just about had to, even sort of like it is now, it's pretty hard to make a living playing music.
Right.
And I don't hardly know of any of them around here. My music heroes from my childhood, some of them that played so good and so great players, I don't know hardly any of them that made a living playing music.
So they always had some other kind of job, or they were farmers or something like that?
They were farmers or did some other kind of job.
Right.
E.C. Ball that lived right in this community, he's one of my influences as far as a guitar player, a thumb picker, guitar player, lived right in this community, and he was so good that I believe he could have been played anywhere, he at least should have been Doc Watson's level or something like that.
Right.
And he drove the school bus and ran the community store, but he played music every weekend, and he later on played gospel music a lot, played every Sunday, and had radio shows in Galax and Jefferson and Marion. And
Oh, wow.
And, he was a busy musician.
Right.
And played with all kinds of people and everybody. But he still, mostly all he ever did too much was worked in the school bus and stuff.
Right.
But he played music probably every day and wrote tunes and was a fantastic musician that should have been on the Grand Ole Opry or something, as far as I was concerned.
Right.
Or lots of other people too.
Right.
And he was he was one, and there was several others in the community just like that. And it is even back at that time when his early career, Doc Watson just lived 40 minutes away over in Deep Gap, and he was the same thing. You'd hear tell of him going to the Fiddlers Convention and playing. They say my buddy Albert Hash that helped me, a fiddle maker, he was a good player too. Mm-hmm. They'd go to contests, and he went to a Fiddlers Convention contest one time, and I think he had managed to beat Doc in his fiddle playing and whatever he did, and come in ahead of Doc's thing, and the prize was a bag of flour. and Albert said he sort of felt sorry for this poor old fella that was blind,
Right.
that couldn't see anything, and I think he won the prize, but he gave the bag of flour with the contest to him, which was probably a pretty important thing at the time.
Right.
And I remember Albert telling me that story one time.
What sparked your interest in instrument building originally?
Well, I think probably by living in this community, nobody had money.
Right.
Much. Everybody was wasn't not poor. We had plenty of stuff to eat always and that kind of thing. But if you wanted something fancy, like a shiny new guitar that sounded good, that was just impossible.
Right.
You could have bought seemed to me like you could have bought an automobile as easy.
Right.
And I always wanted a good guitar, and the first guitar I ever had was not bad. It was an old Recording King, mm-hmm. and it is one of EC had handed down, and stuff. And when he got his Martin, that guitar went to his sister-in-law, and then my brother bought it from her. And when I was 5 years old, I got that old guitar to bang on and started learning a few chords and started playing. But I wanted one of those Martins like EC's so bad I couldn't stand it. But there was no way me or my family could have afforded anything like that. And I grew up making toys I played with.
Okay.
And wooden things of everything, little slingshots or anything to roll and play with.
Okay.
And toys and cars and trucks. If I was even fortunate enough to get a store-bought one for Christmas or something, I always took it apart and seen how it worked, or used the wheels off of it and make my own. I just thought I had to do that with everything.
Right.
And when it got so I needed a better guitar, I thought, well, I've always made these things, and they ain't made out of nothing but wood, pretty mm-hmm. much. I should be able to make one. And Mr. Ball wouldn't let me take the strings off of his old guitar or anything, to feel in it.
Right.
But I could draw around the outside of it and measure everything else that I could.
Okay.
And so I got really into it by that. And the first one I made worked and would play.
Right.
And then, after that, it wasn't long till, I thought, well, I should be able to make a better one.
Right.
And, the influence of the old-time music and just wanting to better instruments play. Mm-hmm. And that's what caused me to be an instrument maker, for sure. Because, and then it wasn't too long till I got my next guitar. Albert Hash was the fiddle player mm-hmm. that my dad knew, and that's how I got sort of connected to. The first time I tried to make a guitar, I got the old rubber glue that my dad put weather stripping on his truck doors, and I slipped my mom's dresser drawer bottom out and laid it in the branch and soaked the walnut veneer off of it.
Okay.
So it was thin enough to bend. And that's how I put my first guitar together. I worked on it all summer from my school vacation when I had to farm. You had to seem like I thought had to work all the time.
Right.
But there's a little bit of time that I could go out in the back building out there where I had everything spread out and nothing but a pocket knife and a keyhole saw and a few hand tools like that to work with. And that's all I had to work with. But I got a guitar made. That looked like a guitar and it, I had it put together with that old glue and I'd looked at my old Recording King. I had it more to go by then.
Right.
And it was a pretty good looking guitar.
Yeah.
And when it got hot in August,
oh no,
that old heat set in on that old rubber glue. I went out there one day and that thing had come apart and blossomed out like a morning glory. The sides, they just totally come apart.
That had to be a disappointing day.
Yeah, that was pretty bad. And I hadn't even told my dad or anything. People thought she's crazy for trying to make a guitar.
Right.
You could make a sled or farm equipment and stuff like that, but to make a musical instrument, they thought I was afraid they thought I'd lost my mind, and my dad could tell there was something wrong with me. Right. And I questioned me, and I thought, well, I tried to make a guitar and said it all come apart.
Right.
And he was. I think he felt sorry for me a little bit, and he said, well, the next time it's a rainy day, we can't work or something, I'll take you to see Albert Hash. And my dad knew him because Albert had fixed his fiddles and stuff before. And he said, that guy, he can even make a fiddle. I mean, he's worked on my fiddle, and I think he can even make them,
Right.
And he'll probably tell you what to do, everything. And sure enough, went over there, and Albert turned out to be one of my heroes, you know, and he told me how to bend wood, and he gave me a piece of an old mahogany door somebody threw out. It's really cheap wood and plywood and stuff. And he said, this is mahogany. He said, that's the same thing a Martin's made out of.
Yeah.
That about drove me wild.
Right.
But he gave me all that stuff and told me how to heat a pipe red hot and wet your wood and you can bend your sides. Mm-hmm. And see, that first one was just stuck together with the spring,
Right.
I mean, it still had all that tension. When that glue let loose, it just went everywhere. But anyway, he told me how to bend and what kind of glue to use to get you some of that Elmer's, or sort of like Elmer's, but it's weldwood cement glue. It's just white glue. And sure enough, that guitar I still have here is still together from that day. And so that. And then I worked probably a year, to get that guitar made. Yeah. And I couldn't wait to go show it to Albert, And when I went over there, it would play. You could tune it and play it. And Albert was a very encouraging person. That helped more than almost anything else. Almost better than any instructions he had, because he didn't know how to make guitars himself. He made beautiful fiddles.
Right.
And but he looked at that guitar and said, Lord, son, if I'd known you'd done this good, I'd have got you some better wood. Bragging on you like that really helps.
Yeah, the encouragement helps.
And encourages. And he got a catalog out and said, I'm going to order you I'll order you some rosewood. That's the same thing Mr. Ball's Martin's made out of,
Right.
And I couldn't wait. He ordered and got me a set of rosewood. And my number 2 guitar actually sounded pretty good.
Yeah.
And I got it back not too long back, and I have it in my collection.
Nice.
And so that's a pretty exciting thing. And Albert helped that, and the influence of playing music. And then when I got that guitar, I had a better guitar. I could play better and everything. And that's the music stuff encouraged me to build. And
right.
And I sold that guitar for $40 and a hard shell case. And I thought I'd hit the big time. Yeah. And then I took that $40 and bought me some more wood, and I've been doing that ever since.
Well, this next part of the podcast is going to be a real humdinger. We dig into some real meaty territory here with Jason from the Martin Museum, we talk about not only the origin of the Jimmie Rodgers guitar, there's the mythology that it was some kind of an endorsement deal. Jason will fill you in on the details of that. But if you're a guitar fan or you hang around guitar fans and you hear all these numbers and letters getting thrown around to describe Martin guitars, this is the time to tune in, and this is going to be your Rosetta Stone to figure out and then impress your friends with how much you know about Martin guitars. Every Martin guitar is issued a size number and a style number, and let's go back to Jason right now and learn all about this directly from the Martin people. This wasn't an endorsement guitar, because there's another famous Jimmie Rodgers guitar, the Wayman guitar, that you see pictures of him with. But that was kind of an endorsement deal, and what I've heard / read is that he really didn't play that guitar very much. He played that Martin. So this wasn't an endorsement deal. He physically ordered and bought this guitar.
Exactly.
Okay.
Because Martin had the stance for the longest time that it doesn't matter who you were. You could be Jimmie Rodgers, the most popular musician in the United States. You're still going to buy a guitar like everybody else. It's just the way they were.
Right.
I've read so many letters from musicians back in the 20s and 30s saying, hey, if you give me this guitar, I'll give you all this free publicity.
Right.
Martin was never interested in it.
Really?
No, they thought, you should buy your guitar like everybody else. And yeah, that's what Jimmie Rodgers did.
That's pretty funny.
I mean, because if you look at it, they were a small company. They didn't really have the wiggle room to just give musicians guitars.
Now, I know, Martin obviously has a huge collection of Martin guitars. Did you guys ever try and acquire the Jimmie Rodgers Blue Yodel guitar?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. I mean, there could have been conversations about it, but yeah, nothing that I know of.
Out of all of the famous Martin guitars like, Willie Nelson's famous Martin guitar, why this guitar? Why does this one capture people's attention? And, when they publish lists of the most valuable guitars in the world, this one is often close, if not at the top of the list. What about this particular guitar makes it so valuable?
It's such a unique instrument because, one, it was owned by the father of country music.
Right.
You talk about influential artists. I mean, Jimmie Rodgers, when it comes to country music, he's at the top because so many musicians looked up to him for so long. And then two, it's just unique.
Right.
I mean, you're not going to find anything else like that. I mean, a pre-war D45, yeah, it's rare and collectible. But if you put two 1942 D45s next to each other, they're going to look the same. Right. But nothing is going to look like Jimmie Rodgers Blue Yodel.
Right. Absolutely. Let's back up just a little bit for people who don't know about Martin's lettering and the number system. Tell us a little bit about, we've thrown these numbers around like 1, 000, and those kind of things. So tell us what the numbers designate and then what the letters designate on the different models of Martin guitars.
Okay. So that first number is the size of the body.
Okay.
So it's actually the higher the number, the smaller the guitar. Like a size 5 is smaller than a size 1.
Is there anything smaller than a 5?
No.
Other than a ukulele, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. We do offer, we build them only in our custom shop now, but it wasn't introduced until the early 1980s, a size 7.
Okay.
But the reason why it's called a size 7, it's a 7/8 size dreadnought.
Okay. Gotcha.
But since the beginning of the company, the size 5 was the smallest.
Okay. Gotcha.
And then you would work your way down. And then, right now, the smallest style we're building in a full-size guitar is a single O.
Okay.
And then you have your double O, triple O, an M body, which is also referred to as a 4O, 4-aught. And then you get into your Ds, your dreadnoughts.
Right.
And where that comes from is when Martin first built the guitar, the largest warship at the time was the HMS Dreadnought from the British Navy. And so they borrowed the name of the ship for the guitar because it was so much bigger than anything they had ever built. They weren't quite sure if their number system would work with it.
Right, right. And so what was driving this increase in body size and the steel strings? You mentioned Hawaiian music and then the recording industry and radio industry are blossoming at this time, and string bands are starting to happen. Were people looking for more volume out of guitars? What was really going on that drove this size increase?
Exactly. That's what it was, volume. Because at this point, the guitar is a very popular instrument on the vaudeville circuit, especially Hawaiian style guitar.
Right.
And there was no amplification at that point. And so in order for them to get more volume, one, they needed steel strings, and two, they needed a guitar that was larger.
Right.
To get more projection.
Right.
Now, I also wanted to touch on, we were talking about the sizes.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at a Martin guitar, you see like a D28. So the D is for dreadnought.
Correct.
And then you have that 28 number.
Mm-hmm.
So where that comes from, that was the original wholesale price of a guitar like that back before the Civil War.
Wow. Okay.
So if you would have ordered a 128, it would have cost the wholesale dealer $28.
Okay.
So what happened was Martin's distributors and them became so familiar with those numbers that when they needed to increase prices, instead of changing it to like a 29 or a 30, they just started calling it the style number or the number of ornamentation.
Okay.
So now we consider it just an appointment level, which is a combination of specific woods and binding materials. So
the lower the number, the less fancy the guitar generally is.
Exactly. So
Right.
If you look at one of our style 15s, it has the rosette inlay, but it doesn't have any binding or top inlay.
Mm-hmm.
So as you go up, they get a little bit more ornate until you get to the style 45, which has pearl all over the top, back, and sides of the body, the fingerboard, the headstock.
Right.
Exactly. That's what Jimmie Rodgers wanted.
It's a bling machine, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Just as Jimmie Rodgers' guitar was a one-of-a-kind, Jimmie himself was a one-of-a-kind, and his musical style seemed for a lot of people to come out of nowhere. He was steeped in the blues, vaudeville, popular music, a lot of music that hadn't crept back into the hills. And my conversation with Wayne Henderson veered into what his influences were and if he listened to Jimmie Rodgers music himself and if the people in the area that he grew up in listened to Jimmie Rodgers. And his answers really surprised me. And the fact that the people, they knew the Carter family repertoire because they had lived it themselves, but they had never heard anything quite like Jimmie Rodgers before. So let's talk to Wayne a little bit about the influences musically in his life and the area where he came from in Rugby, Virginia, and how people reacted to this blazing star that came across the sky. Now, do you think there's something special about the area here? And I think you already touched on it a little bit because we're at this kind of juncture of so many different states. And so tell us a little bit about the history of music in Grayson County, and you've already covered some of it. And one of the questions I had too, were songs from like Jimmie Rodgers' repertoire, was that part of the repertoire of people that people played in this area? It
sure was. Now we had not everybody had record players,
right?
But we had our family had an old Victrola, which most people did. Around had one of those old played 78 records, and we had a couple of Jimmie Rodgers records, and we never didn't collect records or know too much about it. And Doc, he's told me all kinds of stories about they ordered stuff from Montgomery Ward, the catalog.
Right.
You got a free record sometimes if that's what you were into.
Okay.
And said his mom got him every record in the world, over the years. But we had a couple of Jimmie Rodgers records. One of them was Pistol Packing Papa.
Yeah.
And that might have been the only Jimmie Rodgers, but I listened to it all the time. Probably wore that record out.
When your options are limited, you're going to listen to it probably more often, right?
Oh yeah. And we had a few Carter family records.
Yeah.
And one I listened to had one from Henry Whitter, who, I don't know if you ever heard of him or not. He's actually from Freeze, Virginia.
Yeah.
But he had one about the fox chase where he played the harmonica.
Oh, yeah, I know
barked and carried on, and then right on the end of it, he said, and then they caught the fox.
Right.
He
does all the dog barks and stuff like that.
Dog barks.
Yeah.
I wore that record out, too.
Right.
And we didn't have a lot of records. We didn't. Jimmie Rodgers was immensely popular ever since the Bristol sessions or whatever, and his records sold big, and and almost everybody had them.
He comes out of a little bit of a different tradition than, say, the Carter family, where they're kind of more based in like the mountain old time music.
Oh yeah.
What do you think? He had a little more of the blues and vaudeville and stuff in his music. But that still appealed to the people in this area.
Oh yeah, I think it did. It might be something that they hadn't heard much.
Right.
Around here now, that old time music like a Carter family played.
Right.
Almost every family had somebody that could play that.
Right.
Could play that stuff and sing those old songs and do stuff like that. But Jimmie Rodgers yodeling and those guitar licks he did was pretty fancy,
Back
more
then,
than
right?
I didn't know anybody that could do that.
Really?
Except Mr. Ball was a great player, but he didn't play Jimmie Rodgers licks, and that, this sort of quick single note stuff, which was sort of like what Doc got to doing later on too.
Right.
And I know Jimmie Rodgers was a huge influence on Doc.
Right.
I'm sure he probably had all of his records,
Right. Where was Riley Puckett from?
Riley Puckett played with a band. Now, he was an influence on everybody. And that's who Mr. Ball talked about all the time.
Yeah.
And Riley Puckett was, I think, from Georgia. But anyway, he played with the Skillet Lickers, which was a band from Georgia down there. Gid Tanner was the fiddler. And a great band, and they made records too, and that's how come people knows about them.
Right.
And they had he was the most amazing guitar player I'd ever heard at the time, because they must have the most old-time string band records that you heard. You almost didn't hear the guitar player.
Right.
And it might have been they didn't have good guitars, many of them.
Right.
But they never put the microphone close to the guitar player to hear his backup rhythm, and especially they just didn't play no lead. That was just something they didn't do too much. That was fiddles and banjos to do that. But Riley Puckett played a style of rhythm with all the runs, and he would run so far out on a limb you'd think he'd never get back. But the time he got done with that run, it would always be back perfect in rhythm and time with everything, and that just amazed everybody.
Yeah,
me too. That I'd heard that record, I couldn't figure out how to do that.
Yeah,
and Mr. Ball could do it a little bit. And that's what he's saying. And I've heard Doc say lots of times, he learned all kinds of stuff from Riley Puckett.
Yeah,
and that was. I don't know that anybody yet today can play just exactly like he did.
Yeah. Now, obviously, you're a fan of Martin guitars. And Martin guitars, especially in an area like this, it must have been pretty hard for somebody to buy a Martin guitar.
Oh, yeah. They were almost... that. Mr. Ball had that one, and he wasn't much better off than any of us. I don't know how he got that thing.
Right.
But he bought it new in 1949.
Wow.
And he was a pretty prominent player, and deserved to have a nice guitar like that. And that was the only one anywhere in this community.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk about Martin guitars a little bit for people listening who may not know the history of Martin guitars. Let's talk about the guitars, I guess, maybe that had the biggest impact on country and old-time music are those beautiful pre-war Martin guitars. Tell us what makes those guitars so special and kind of where they fit into the history of Martin guitars.
Well, I feel like at those, I think they call them golden age, guitars made during the 30s. And I think back at that time, Martin had their best workers that they ever had probably, and they for certainly had the best materials. Back at that time, Brazilian rosewood was... I think they ordered that stuff in a log form to start with, went into some company that they didn't resaw it, but they went to this company and they bought it for 70 cents a pound.
Wow.
I've heard. I can't imagine buying wood by weight, Like nowadays you have to buy a set of sides or back.
Right.
And they had wonderful materials, and they had the spruce that they used back in those days was Appalachian stuff, grew in this region, this in the east, anywhere from Georgia to New York.
Okay.
And the most of their spruce that they use come from New York, and they called it Adirondack spruce. But it's all just a species of spruce called red spruce.
Okay.
And it grows all over the east places. But, the best of any spruce grows high on the mountain or the north side where it grows slow and has fine, close grain. And they had lots of that stuff. You can look at any of their old guitars, and the quality of that wood and stuff in there is just absolutely amazing.
Right.
And you find wood like that nowadays, but it's pretty scarce and far between.
Right.
And small builders like me can find usually plenty of good quality wood. But back in 30s and 40s, they'd make 5,000 guitars a year.
Right.
And it's just hard to imagine how much wood that took to do that.
Right.
And you look at those old guitars and you look how great quality all of it was.
Right.
And they were, their process of building and their selection of wood, somebody was really particular, and they didn't use anything but almost the best quality stuff that you could get. And they were just a great company Gibson was about the only other company around that made stuff, and they made great stuff too. They had, I don't think he was quite as particular about their materials and stuff as Martin was, but they're still nice guitars and good quality instruments. But Martin just made a lot of really great instruments, and some of they like to make fancy stuff.
Right.
They made guitars that had pearl binding on them, and like the Jimmie Rodgers guitar. That was a special order guitar made, I think, in 1928, and what they called the Triple Aught 45, and that 45 was the style of the guitar. And I have, in my collection here, I have 3 of those pearl-bound Martins.
Wow.
And you can just look at those guitars and look at the quality of the wood, and it's just unbelievable what nice wood they could get.
Right.
But they probably had a selection and they had, I know at times they've had one person that selected wood for them. He went through the pile. This wood's good enough, like that. And that is one reason that they always had high quality wood in their stuff.
As we approach the end of this episode of Instrumental History, let's talk to both Jason and Wayne about the Blue Yodel guitar. Get a little bit of history on it, a little bit about the construction, and the personal interaction between the Martin Guitar Company and Jimmie Rodgers, the father of country music. The Blue Yodel guitar, Jimmie Rodgers 1928 00045, is currently on display at the Birthplace of Country Music Museum. Tell us what you know about that guitar.
Well, I know Jimmie Rodgers, when he got started recording, he was using a 0018. So it was a little smaller, one of Martin's less expensive guitars at that time. And so when he releases his records and royalties start coming in, that's when he orders his Blue Yodel from Martin.
Okay.
So he wanted this name on the fingerboard, Blue Yodel on the headstock. He wanted it to be style 45 with pearl all around the body.
Right.
And then after he received the guitar, he had a sign painter paint thanks on the back so he could flip it over and thank the crowd.
So that was not done by Martin. The thanks on the back was not done by Martin. Okay.
That was not done by Martin. I'm not sure who did that, but it wasn't done by Martin.
Okay.
And I do know that C.F. Martin III was a huge fan of Jimmie Rodgers. They corresponded a lot. Jimmie Rodgers were referred to, because C.F. Martin III went by Fred or Frederick, his middle name, and Jimmie Rodgers would refer to him as Friend Fred in his letters. That's how he would start out. Yeah. Right. And so C.F. Martin III wrote a special note that he put on the inside and hand-delivered the guitar to Jimmie Rodgers. And now, there was some speculation that it was in Washington, D.C., but it was most likely Camden, because that's where Jimmie Rodgers would have been recording in 1928.
Right. for the Victor Talking Machine
Yes.
Company at the time. Was Ralph Peer involved in did you see him in the correspondence at all? We had heard that maybe he helped, talk between Martin and Jimmie Rodgers, but you seem to indicate there was a direct connection between Jimmie and Fred.
Yeah, yes, there was.
Okay.
And, yeah, they corresponded. We have quite a few letters from Jimmie Rodgers to Martin.
Really? That's got to be amazing to sit and read that kind of stuff. I mean, are they pretty casual or are they business?
Pretty laid back. And, originally they were handwritten and then eventually went to some type letters. So I don't know if he had somebody typing the letters for him at that point when he, gained a little bit of success. But they were usually on hotel stationery.
I was just going to ask if you saw any cool stationery or anything like that, because a traveling musician would be in a different spot like all the time.
Yeah.
Now that guitar has a kind of an interesting history because Jimmie passes away in 1933. So fill us in a little bit about what happens to the guitar after 1933.
So Jimmie's widow has the guitar, and Ernest Tubb comes along, and he was. Jimmie Rodgers was a huge influence on him. I mean, early on, that's the style he sung in, but I guess what happened was he had to have a throat operation and it changed his singing voice. So he kind of comes up with his own style.
Right.
But still, he starts this traveling show with Jimmie's widow, and she allows him to use the Jimmie Rodgers 00045.
Okay.
So Ernest Tubb would go on to use it for a number of years.
And then, so was it given to Ernest Tubb, or was it on kind of a permanent loan to Ernest Tubb?
It was a permanent loan because after I'm not quite sure when the year was, he ended up giving the guitar back.
Okay. And then as far as I know, then the guitar was in the possession of the Jimmie Rodgers Museum in Meridian, Mississippi for a long time.
Yes.
Do you know kind of when it arrived in Mississippi?
That I don't know. I don't know that exact date. I just know it was there when Martin did the Jimmie Rodgers commemorative edition.
Okay.
That's where the representatives from our company went to view the original guitar and kind of get an idea of how we should replicate it. Because
there is a replica version of that guitar, isn't there?
Is.
And those were for sale, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I've seen a few of those.
Yeah, you could purchase it with or without the thanks on the back if you wanted. The one we have in our museum collection does have, the thanks on the back. And then we actually have a separate back displayed next to the guitar just with the thanks on it. So you can see what the back of the guitar would look like without, having to take it out of the display case.
Right. So it would be a substantially valuable guitar, even if it wasn't owned by Jimmie Rodgers. Is that correct?
Well, yeah. I mean, you look at Martin guitars from that period, and especially style 45s, and they're worth quite a bit. So
you're 1 year out of what you consider the golden age, right? You said that's 1929, so you're at 1928.
I mean, it's close enough because
right?
A couple of the factors. I mean, prime factors when it comes to guitars from that era, or if it's built with steel strings.
Correct. Okay.
Which that was originally a steel string guitar, and that's what the majority of people look for because, a lot of people when they're buying these guitars, they want to play them.
Right.
I mean, there's certain people that are just going to, hang it on a wall or put it in their collection, but I mean, people want to play them, want to know what they sound like.
Let's talk a little bit about the Jimmie Rodgers guitar, and I think we already talked a little bit about it. 1928 00045. So that would be a valuable guitar, even if Jimmie Rodgers hadn't owned it. That's correct?
That's a super valuable guitar. I have Martin books. I could look and see how many they made, but I can't remember now. But not many.
Right.
Like a guitar like that was fancy and expensive back in those days, and that even 1928, I can't remember for sure, but it's probably just $100 and some that thing cost.
Wow, yeah.
And now a triple op, 45 from 1928 or late 20s, it's probably a couple of $100,000. Even if it's not his.
Right.
And that that was, at that time, the biggest thing it made, biggest, fanciest guitar they could make at that time.
So the Triple O was the biggest guitar you could get in 1928?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the biggest one. They hadn't made D's yet.
Right.
And the first fancy D one was another, star person, Gene Autry.
Right.
He liked it. He had one real similar to, Gene Autry was a Jimmie Rodgers fan.
Oh, yeah.
And, he did his songs. And
I've heard some of those original. He sounds almost exactly like Jimmie Rodgers.
He could really do it.
Yeah.
And he had a guitar just like that.
Yeah.
He had his wasn't quite his was a double alt, which is almost hard to tell by looking the difference in the size.
Right.
But he had one of those and his name inlaid in it the same way and everything. I'm sure that's all probably influence from him.
Right.
And then Gene Autry, when he got more famous and got to doing movies and wanted to sound bigger and everything, he convinced Martin that by 1933, they were making those big guitars, like D size.
Right.
And he convinced Martin to make him one of those big old guitars with the fancy pearl work on it.
Right.
And so that sort of accidentally came about the first D45.
Was that a slope shoulder one?
It was a slope shoulder, and I have seen that.
Yeah.
I went out on playing on a tour in California one time, and that Gene Autry Museum is out there. That's where it is.
Yeah.
And I made a special trip to go somewhere in Los Angeles, I think it is. And sure enough, that museum is there, and the guitar was a little part of that. He's, all of his owned the Los Angeles Angels at the time, full of baseball stuff, which I liked that too. But all kinds of, his Western cowboy stuff, pistols and every kind of gun you can imagine in there. But that guitar was sitting in a case out by itself.
Yeah.
And you could walk all the way around it and look at it.
Wow.
And I could look at it and see, could use a neck set probably, but they wasn't going to let you touch it. But that's, I did get to see that guitar.
Right.
And that's probably one of the most famous ones there is.
I bet, yeah. Now, did they make more of the slope shoulder 45s?
Yeah, they made the second one they made was some fellow named Jackie Moore.
Okay.
He was in the movies or famous somehow.
Yeah.
And they went back and forth a bunch on that to get that to suit him and the way he wanted and everything. And
so were those 12 fret slotted headstocks?
They were 12 fret slot head.
Right.
Guitars
and
pearl all over them.
So those are really rare.
They're really rare. Those two, and they might have later on made maybe a couple more. In the process, those D45s of the original ones, the pre-war ones, and I guess what you call it, the original ones, they only made 91 of them.
Wow. Yeah.
And so they're pretty rare. You don't see one of them very often.
And the move from the slope to the flat shoulders, was that really just to get those extra 2 frets open?
Yeah, that's when they started making a longer neck was with the OEMs.
Okay.
Like that, and which was what they call the orchestra model.
Yeah.
And they was inspired by a banjo player.
Okay.
And a guy named Purry Bechtel was a plectrum banjo player.
Okay.
Back at the time and famous, and he talked them into making him a guitar, but he wanted one with a longer, slimmer neck that resembled his banjo.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 2 of Instrumental History. My name is Clint Holley, and I've been your host today. I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Jason Honor, Chief Archivist and Historian at the Martin Guitar Company in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, and also to Wayne Henderson, Master Guitar Builder and Luthier. I would also like to thank Radio Bristol and the Birthplace of Country Music Museum for giving me the opportunity to produce this program. And I would like to thank Harrison Hunt and Dave Polster from Well Made Music for technical, editing, and mastering assistance on this episode. Tune in to episode 3 in 2 weeks, or 1 week if you're listening to the rebroadcast of this, where we explore the ripple effect of the Bristol sessions on local musicians in Bristol and worldwide. Until then, have a great day.